Okay, so I've done this as an academic paper, not too heavy, I hope, but I wanted to, we were keen for different people just to talk in their own particular ways, and I just wanted to give you a sense of what my, if you like, my day-to-day practice is and how I go about dealing with things. Okay, as you will have seen, one of the many strands we have running through the programme is a focus on the past, the question of how looking at the past can go hand in hand with thinking about environmental issues in the present. It's one of the things I'm particularly interested in my own research. Personally, I'm interested in the ancient Mediterranean in particular, the pre-modern past more generally. We've seen other glimpses of that from Catherine and Laura yesterday, maybe from Michael Marder on medieval material, or even actually more in today, I suppose, on talking about indigenous knowledges earlier. Also other slightly different ways of thinking about the past. Christina Alt's talk about a much more recent past, the early 20th century texts of science fiction and scientific imagination, or even David Farrier's presentation on imagining the present as a past for future generations. And I said this before in response to Maureen, but I'll just say it again for the benefit of those who are listening to the recording. One of the things I'm really interested in is developing, if you like, a compendium, to use Francesca's fantastic word from the title of this, of all the different ways in which one might think about the past in relation to environmental discourse in the present. So anyway, what I want to do today is just to give you a glimpse of some of the texts that I work on, and give you a feel for what it's like to read them. All of these were written around 2,000 years ago in Greek under the Roman Empire. I hope you'll tell me what you think of them and how they strike you. These are really difficult texts. I don't want to disguise that. They're not easy to deal with. But obviously I'll do my best to make sense of them and give you the context you need. These texts are the landscape that I move through in my day-to-day life, in my research, in my teaching. They've looked different to me at different times in my life. But I think more and more now about how they can speak to us, if at all, in relation to the environmental challenges we are all facing. A lot of my work recently has been on mountains, the history of mountains, mountain environments and landscapes. But for today, I've got something a bit new, a bit different. So, okay, let's go. Not actually straight onto that. Before I move on to some of that work, I just wanted to say something very briefly about the kind of institutional collaborative context for all of this. So, the Centre for Ancient Environmental Studies is based in the School of Classics in St Andrews, but with a worldwide membership now of several hundred researchers. It's really an expanding area, I think. My colleagues Ruben Post and Andrea Brock, who were here yesterday, and in Andrea's case this morning, have been a big part of putting that together. So Ruben works on climate variation in antiquity, among other things. Andrea works on the city of Rome, particularly the archaeological history of the river Tiber, history of flooding in the city of Rome. Both have helped a lot with the wider programme of academic events that we've been putting on, funded now partly by a network grant from the Royal Society of Edinburgh. I've talked a lot to Giacomo Savani, currently at UCD, but Giacomo's coming to St Andrews for a year next year as an RSE-funded fellow, which is fantastic. Giacomo ran an amazing conference recently in Dublin, there it is, on ancient environments, which involved a number of artists talking about their responses to the classical past, and that was one of the inspirations for me in wondering about whether there's more to do along those lines. And Giacomo's actually running, well, you can tell everybody later if you want to, Giacomo, but more about this, but there's a follow-up event actually quite soon now, next month, isn't it? Online, is that completely an online event? Yeah, absolutely. Fantastic. And also just a quick plug for Giacomo's podcast series there, the Sustainable Past, which is a series of 5 or 6, is it 6 podcasts together with Patty Baker, which came out earlier in the year. And yeah, obviously it'd be great to hear more from you, Giacomo, if there are things you want to add in discussion. Okay, how do we bring ancient environmental history into dialogue with the present? Clearly there are plenty of precedents for talking about the relationship between ancient and modern environmental thinking. It's not as if no one has ever done this before. But I think a lot of pronouncements on that issue have been quite problematic just because of a tendency to oversimplify. So one example might be the claim in this very, very influential article, some of you may know this, by Lynn White Jr. from 1967, the claim that early Christianity was responsible effectively for the anthropocentrism that is at the heart of the kind of environmental vandalism that we live with today. Or from others, the idea that the Roman Empire was a kind of origin point for these habits of environmental degradation, which we're still living with. Of course, there's some truth in both of those claims. They're interesting claims to make. But I think the problem is the way in which they've often been presented in these absurdly reductive terms, in ways that underestimate the complexity, really, the variety of ancient environmental thinking. And this piece by White is a case in point. From a classicist perspective, it looks as though he's done this on the back of an envelope. It's got a very brief paragraph, these incredible sweeping generalizations about the ancient world. So my first point is really just that we need to respect the alienness of the past, and we need to respect its complexity if we want to bring it into these discussions at all. That seems to me to be essential as a starting point. And in some respects, I would like to think that the process of studying the past can be a model for cultural literacy today. It's a way of starting to think about the huge variety of different cultures of environmental engagement, which so often I think gets lost from view in the way we're talking about these problems today. So I was talking last night to Julia from Iceland, Julia, for those who didn't meet her, she runs an artist residency in Iceland. I was just talking to her about translation problems. I've often thought about the question of how do you translate the word environment into ancient Greek? You just can't do it in a way which is at all close. And she was talking about similar problems with Icelandic, for example. So there's one nice example there of how that can work. Okay, so I'm arguing, first of all, that we need to be quite careful about anachronism, about making the inhabitants of the ancient world mirror images of ourselves. Not least because human-caused environmental climate change in the form we're experiencing it is a modern phenomenon. It just doesn't have any ancient precedents. But at the same time, I also want to argue that in a sense we also need to be more anachronistic. I think the two can go together at the same time, or at least if we're going to be anachronistic, we're better off doing it quite openly and honestly, reusing images from the past for our own purposes in the present. Now, maybe to this audience that's not a surprising thing to be claiming, but academics get quite nervous about anachronism sometimes, and you can see why if you think about all the ways in which the classical past has been appropriated anachronistically to justify terrible things. But actually there are I think very powerful models in ancient commentary tradition for ancient writers using texts from the past quite openly and honestly and really unashamedly for their own purpose in the present, which are potentially quite inspiring. I think thinking about storytelling is really helpful for this. Clearly ancient mythical narrative was in some sense a repository for environmental wisdom. And obviously there's been similar work on indigenous narrative in various ways. Again, Maureen was mentioning this earlier on. So a resource for its original audiences, but perhaps also for us. And even in the ancient world, some of the force of that narrative always came from its alienness. So mythical narrative, even for ancient listeners, was always set in a very distant past, in a world that was quite alien in some ways. And as clearly it also is for us. And that's where some of its force can come from, perhaps. Okay. I just want to give you four, before I kind of go into some examples, I just want to give you 4 areas where I think we might start to wonder about connection points between past and present. A few kind of headlines. The first is responses to environmental stress, then sustainability, post-human perspectives, and scale. Very briefly on all of these. So first of all, environmental stress, ancient responses. I learned a lot about this heading in particular from my colleagues Ruben and Andrea. If you want to hear more, this is a recent talk that Ruben gave in Glasgow actually last month, which is really good. I think I listened to this last week. I'd really recommend it if you want to hear more about that. More and more recently there's been a move towards recognizing the way in which ancient cultures had to deal with environmental variation. We can chart this now in extraordinary detail. The depth, the kind of volume of paleo-environmental data that we now have available to us is really astonishing. We can really chart climate variation in a lot of detail. And there's more and more work on how that was a factor in historical processes in some cases in the ancient world. Obviously, one thing you can use that data for, which Ruben brings out very powerfully in his own work, I think, is to show in absolutely clear-cut ways that the level of anthropogenic climate change we're experiencing now is not natural. Okay, so this is potentially an effective way of responding to sceptical views. These people who come along and say, "Oh, there's always been climate variation. It's always happened. Just look to the past as well." You can show just by showing those graphs that what we've seen in recent decades is on an utterly different scale from the kind of speed of variation in the pre-modern past. Okay, other people have studied various kinds of natural threat or disaster. Obviously, there's now an extraordinary industry of people working in pandemic studies for pre-modern history. Quite a crowded field, I think, now. Not surprising, but I mean, it's cool, which is kind of interesting because I do worry sometimes a little bit about the way in which work on environmental subjects potentially gets caught up in the economy of what you might call the late capitalist academic system, in the sense that people are latching on to marketable subjects, and as I'm sure I am, and it is, in a sense, it's impossible not to be implicated in that, but just important to be self-conscious about it, I suppose. So pandemic studies is not what I want to do here, but I think some of the more interesting work in these areas then takes a further step of exploring ancient notions of, I suppose, what you might call resilience, rather than simply focusing on misleadingly simplistic notions of societal collapse, which are such an obsession of popular discourse and academic discourse today. Can an understanding of ancient resilience help us as a model for current responses, help us to move away from a passive response to environmental stress? And if so, how do you get around all the problems with the rhetoric of resilience? The problem that it can lead us to complacency, to a lack of concern for disadvantaged communities. We just have to get on with it. And my colleagues Ruben and Andrew have recently started a project which aims to encourage engagement with ancient climate variation in schools syllabuses, in Scottish schools, in geography curricula. And I'm sure they'd be very pleased to hear from you if anybody here or anyone listening to this recording has suggestions or on that, or would like to know more. Okay, second point, much more briefly. There we go. Okay, just to point out, there's also been increasing interest in exploring ancient notions of sustainability, ancient systems thinking, I suppose you might call it, the ideas of the Earth as interconnected system, again with half an item models for us in the present. And this is a very recent book, Plato's Pigs by Mark Usher. It's a really fantastic example of that, some amazing readings of ancient texts. But it's a really engaging book, not least because it includes Mark's reflections on his own experience of farming. He has a small rural farm in Vermont, and that's woven through his discussions in the book in ways which I think are wonderful. Third point, again, as I was saying in response to Maureen this morning, there's more and more been a turn influenced, among other things, by new materialist perspectives towards looking at the way in which post-human ways of looking at the world are embedded in ancient texts side by side with more anthropocentric ways of thinking. So here, another fantastic example, recent example by a book by Clara Bosak-Schroeder, Other Natures. It's a great example of that. So she looks at ancient ethnographic writing, writers like Herodotus, basically showing how ancient Greek and Roman authors tend to represent foreign cultures as embedded or immersed in their environments, very sort of closely entwined physically with their environments. Now, those representations are not always intended to be positive from ancient authors, quite the opposite in many cases. What she argues is that they do offer us alternative ways of imagining human environment cultures, challenging those legacies of environmental mastery that we're still living with. And again, she links that to modern practice. So she's got some fantastic sections on modern museum practice, display practice, and the way in which thinking about those issues for the ancient world can help us to re-envisage that. And then finally, I just want to say something about the problem of scale, which has been a major issue for a lot of eco-critical research in the last decade or so. And this book by Amitav Ghosh is one that has had some criticism, but it's one good way into this, I think. I expect everyone here is familiar with this question already. Basically, the issue of the difficulty we have in conceptualizing environmental problems on a global scale, partly because the narrative resources that we're working with, for example, in the realist novel tradition, are so focused on individuals, inhabiting kind of bounded local space. Although I think arguably that's more and more being challenged within science fiction writing in particular. What I want to suggest is just that there may be ways in which ancient Greek and Roman literature can help us with that. So I think this combination of local and global perspectives often comes much more naturally to a lot of ancient genres. They're quite used to jumping around between lots of different scales. So here's just one very brief example of this. I put the Greek on there as well as the translation, just to remind us that it is in Greek. This is from the Iliad. And for those of you who don't know that text in detail, one of the really distinctive things about the poetry of the Iliad, especially in the battlefield scenes, is the way in which the poet uses similes with incredible frequency. So these similes are comparisons, often quite long, extended comparisons, where particular heroes or moments on the battlefield are compared with scenes in imaginary landscapes very far removed from the battlefield at the city of Troy. Many of these are scenes of natural force, flood, forest fire, scenes where human capacity to dominate the landscape is downgraded or marginalized. So one brief example here. As when a river in flood comes down to the plain, a winter torrent from the mountains, forced onwards by the rain of Zeus and carrying with it dry oaks and pines and casting much debris into the sea, so then did shining Aias, Ajax, rush over the plain, driving the enemy before him, slaying horse and man. So essentially, I think the Iliad offers us conflicting images of the relationship between humans and the environment. It's challenging anthropocentric versions of that, but also celebrating human mastery at the same time. We get both of those strands together, and we're invited to hold that whole panorama in our minds as we encounter this. It would have been not as a read text originally, but as a text that one would listen to. And I mean, in a way, I think it's extraordinary that the Iliad has not been exploited more in eco-critical thinking as a kind of basis. I've spent a lot of time looking for examples of this. I keep coming across examples of the Odyssey being used in for example, in climate fiction, in all these kind of post-apocalyptic novels where you see heroes wandering through the landscape like Odysseus. I found very little use of the Iliad in those kinds of contexts. I'd love to know if you know of any examples of that. So there you go, global and local scale. So anyway, I hope that's useful as a kind of whirlwind tour of some of the ways we might start to think about. There we go. Some of the ways we might start to think about ancient and modern together. If you want to read more, some great examples there. Christopher Schliefacker's work, which is a very helpful way into this. Okay, I want to show you now two texts, or rather two sets of texts, which cluster around the themes of my title: disaster, grief, apocalypse, and empire. I think both of those examples might lead us to end up thinking that the classical heritage is part of our problem, part of what we still need to move beyond. But I also want to explore the possibility that we can flip them around and use them in more positive ways. And for the first of those, I want to talk especially about grief. Obviously, there's been a huge amount written about ecological grief recently, charting out different manifestations of that, performing grief in different ways, debating the degree to which grief can be a positive or a negative force. At first sight, it's quite hard to find ancient examples of ecological grief reactions. There's a wonderful exception to that in unpublished work by Eris Williams-Reed at the University of Warwick, who's analysed a series of Safavitic inscriptions from northern Arabia, from the Roman imperial period especially, which just give us an amazing glimpse of local communities dealing with environmental stress, basically dealing with problems of grazing supply and so on, changing conditions. I mustn't say too much about that because it's unpublished work, but I'm very grateful to Eris for sharing that, and I've found it a very inspiring piece to read. But the passage I want to start with now is really very, very different from that, in the sense that it gives us an elite perspective. It's from a text by a writer called Philostratus. This text is The Lives of the Sophists in the early 3rd century CE. It's from the life of a 2nd century orator called Aelius Aristides, and it describes the reaction of the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius to a report of the destruction of the city of Smyrna in an earthquake. I'm going to read this out. It is not boastful praise to say that Aristides was the founder of Smyrna. It's very just and truthful. For when this city was obliterated by earthquakes and chasms that opened up in the ground, Aristides lamented over it to Marcus in such a way that the emperor often groaned over other parts of the lament. When he came to the phrase, "the west winds blow over a desert," the emperor actually shed tears over the text, and in response to this prompting from Aristides, agreed to the rebuilding of the city. Now, if you want to do a contextualizing reading of this, a reading that's very cautious about anachronism, in the way I outlined earlier, you might start by pointing out that environmental concerns are not very high up Philostratus' priority list. So the rest of his work, he's not very interested in environmental issues. We might be inclined to read it as a kind of ecological grief reaction, but arguably Philostratus isn't interested in that at all, actually. Above all, what he's interested in is the power of Aristides' rhetoric to influence the emperor. His work is packed with other scenes of lament, orators lamenting, even I think one or two, well, no, actually maybe it isn't. There are no other scenes of emperors lamenting that I can think of. But my point there is that he's measuring up the emperor against the kind of standards by which he judges the orators that he is talking about there. So that's got nothing to do with the environment whatsoever. So that's an example of what I was saying about earlier about respecting the alienness of ancient texts, I guess. But of course, even so, we can choose to ask what this image can do for us. How can we use it? How can it be made to support or undermine particular modern ways of thinking about grief? Or perhaps to defamiliarize our own experience of grief in environmental context. How do we read it in the light of our own situation? The first thing that occurs to me is that it is very different from the kinds of ecological grief that have tended to get most prominence in the recent scholarship on that phenomenon, which tends to focus on local communities close to the land they inhabit. So this piece by Ashley Consuelo and Neville Ellis comes from basically trying to understand the mental health impacts of environmental ecological grief in contemporary communities in relation to what they call experienced or anticipated ecological losses, including the loss of species, ecosystems and meaningful landscapes due to acute or chronic environmental change. And I mean, actually, that's the kind of thing that Eris Williams-Reed is talking about in that piece I mentioned earlier for those Sapphitic inscriptions, which do seem to give us a glimpse of that local perspective. Another very different place you can go is to this piece by Timothy Clark. He's proposed the concept of Anthropocene horror as an alternative to ecological grief, describing a much less localized anxiety about global climate. Obviously, that shares with the Philostratus passage a sense of detachment from environmental disaster. But really, this is even further removed from what we're seeing with Marcus Aurelius. I think the emperor's grief is at least focused on a particular place, even if he's imagining it from a distance. And yet, even though it doesn't fit into those two different concepts, Philostratus' account does seem to me to have a lot in common with one kind of grief reaction, which is very familiar to us. In other words, concern about environmental damage to a beautiful or iconic place without any particular interest in the fate of its inhabitants. All of this experienced from a position of comfortable elite detachment. Makes me think about the way in which a lot of environmental worry in Western culture, I suppose, is in practice focused around the degradation of famous, beautiful places, flagship species, without attention to the issues of environmental justice and human impact that I suspect are so important to everybody here. So if that's right, that might be an example of where the classical heritage is giving us an image we wouldn't want to follow, standing as a kind of negative example. Even if we can also accept the kind of instrumental power of that approach to environmental campaigning. So Marcus Aurelius stops grieving almost immediately and takes out his checkbook. He takes action straight away, which of course is what we might like in our current situation. Although whether it's the right kind of action is not clear, because he seems to be mainly interested in rebuilding the city. He's interested in the architecture, basically. So it's very problematic in that sense. If we start to delve into Aelius Aristides' surviving works a bit more, we see some factors that complicate that picture even more. Aristides was an extraordinary figure. He's one of the most famous Greek orators of the Roman Empire. He actually wrote a whole series of works on the Smyrna earthquake. And what we find when we look at those works is that they're very much in line with what I was talking about a moment ago. In fact, even more exaggerated in their lack of concern for the impact of disaster on human population. Above all, like the emperor, he seems to be concerned with the buildings. He also is celebrating his freedom from being affected by disaster. He actually boasts about that as a sign of the favours of the protecting divinity Asclepius. So on that account, environmental disaster is okay as long as you're on the right side of it, if you have the god and the Emperor of Rome on your side, as he clearly does. And I just really very briefly want to show you one extraordinary passage where that kind of indifference to the affected populations comes through very powerfully. It's from a work called The Sacred Tales, which is well, there's a whole other story about that I could tell you more about, but well, let me read this. Later, when Albus was governor of Asia, there were many frequent earthquakes, and Mytilene was nearly all thrown down, and in many other cities there was much disturbance, and the villages were wholly destroyed. The people sent emissaries to Clarus, and they fought over the oracle. Holding the olive branch of supplication, they went about the altars and the marketplaces and the circuits of the cities, no one daring to stay at home. And then finally they gave up supplicating. So there's a kind of this brief acknowledgement of these frantic people desperately sort of scurrying around, praying to the gods, desperate to avoid disaster. In these circumstances, the god commanded me to sacrifice publicly an ox to Zeus, the saviour. As to what happened next, who wishes to believe, let him believe, and who does not, to him I say farewell. All those earthquakes stopped, and after that day there was no longer any trouble through the providence and power of the gods and by our necessary administration. Aristotle is effectively claiming to have solved the problem. He stopped the earthquakes through his sacrifice to Zeus. And then basically his point, I won't read the final bit, it's a bit convoluted, but his point there is that the people he encounters have nothing to worry about. The god would not have allowed Aristides to be there himself if there were going to be any more earthquakes, he says. So he's got, in this passage, this just bizarre, extraordinary sense of his own invulnerability. There isn't any sense of grief or anxiety here. It's almost as though the earthquake is actually for him a cause of celebration in this context, because of the way it's allowed him to show the god's favour towards him. Other speeches too, which are less celebratory, which do express grief. For example, we can look at, this is the first of his post-earthquake works, which he says was written spontaneously on hearing the news. The theme of vision is very prominent here. It's an extended comparison, quite interestingly, between the city and a human body here. So he says, indeed, the sights were beyond description. This is what the city was like before the earthquake. Immediately upon approaching, there was a sheen of beauty. There was proportion, measure, stability in its magnitude, as if it were in a single harmony. He goes on to say, where in the earth did you sink? What springs of tears are sufficient for so great an evil? So he's talking about the buildings of the city there, and in this passage, but also even more so in some others, he's actually using really heavily eroticized imagery for the relationship, his own relationship with the city, the emperor's relationship with the city. So in summary there, what I want to suggest is that looking at grief through the example of Marcus Aurelius and Aelius Aristides might make us more upfront about the continuing power of quite problematic ways of thinking about ecological grief that elide the experiences of disadvantaged communities. In Aristides' case, the self-serving, elitist, inhuman connotations of his expressions of grief are much more blatant than they are in their modern equivalents. Perhaps they can help us to think about whether we're at risk of replicating that problem in our own responses. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is that there is a certain strand in the classical tradition where grief reactions can mask a lack of concern for human consequences. We know that already, of course we know that already, that we're at risk of that. But my point is just that maybe looking back to those classical texts can help us to see it even more clearly, because it's so much more blatant there, at least in that case. Or can we flip that round? Is there a positive strand we can cling on to? For example, in this image of environmental errors, this image of love as a basis for environmental grief, which can be a powerful resource, a spur to action, even if it is at risk of negative connotations? Or does this passage even give us a kind of model, a kind of fantasy image of how people in the academic and artistic sectors can speak to power? That's something the Greek intellectuals of the Roman Empire were fascinated by. They theorized that at enormous length. Philostratus does too in this work. He's really interested in that. How do we persuade people in positions of power to take the decisions we need them to quickly, decisively, with no hesitation? So this incredible sense of speed and abruptness, I think, in this sentence here. There's not even a comma or a full stop in between them, at least in the punctuation is the choice of the modern editor, but I think it's right, this incredible movement through to the end of the sentence, almost instantaneous transition from tears through to action, which of course, as I said, is what we desperately need now. Right, now on to Apocalypse. Just to cheer you up. Oh, hang on. Yeah, there we go. Okay, this is a bit briefer, I think, 5-10 minutes. I just want to talk about the ancient heritage of the apocalypse tradition, also the various kinds of biblical environmental disaster narratives that are closely associated to it. We have some water. Okay. Obviously, there's been a huge amount written recently about apocalypse imagery in contemporary discourse, both the power of that imagery and the many problems associated with it. Debates about whether it has, for example, an unproductively traumatizing effect, whether it makes us less inclined to take positive action, also the problem that it oversimplifies vastly complex processes. I'm not going to go into the detail about you know that as well as I do, I expect. But I'm certainly interested in how we can shed new light on our own use of that rhetoric by looking to the past. There's a parallel for that for the biblical flood narrative, particularly in this wonderful book by Lydia Barnett, which I came across really quite recently. She talks about the prevalence of flooding imagery in our contemporary environmental imagination, the importance of understanding what she calls the origins of this pattern of representation and the cultural baggage that comes along with it. It's a version of the same kind of exercise that I want to have a go at here. If we look at environmental imagery in apocalypse texts from the ancient Mediterranean, one of the problems we see immediately is a bit like the one I've already mentioned for Aristides. Fantasies of apocalypse often involve one group being saved and one not. It's the same for narrative patterns like the biblical flood story, of course. So once again, in these texts, there's often a sense that the main goal in responding to environmental crisis is to make sure you're on the right side of the line. If you've made sure of that, there's nothing more to worry about. You can watch everyone else's discomfort from a position of detachment or even exaltation. And that's obviously a rather problematic precedent, to state the obvious. Now, of course, you can find many ways of repurposing that imagery. So some eco-critics talk about the notion of what they call apocalypse without the kingdom. So you keep the apocalyptic imagery, but you lose the sense that it has different impacts on different people. You can do that. You can also rewrite apocalypse traditions so that the point of them is not to anticipate them as inevitable, but actually to stop them from happening. Okay, so that's another way people get around this problem. But what I want to suggest now is that the sense of overturning injustice is worth hanging on to, actually, because of one other factor in the ancient apocalypse tradition, which is the way in which apocalypse narratives often arise in the context of empire. They give its expression to the desire from communities in a position of weakness to overturn their own experiences of oppression or marginality. And my impression is that this context of empire in the apocalypse tradition is one aspect of apocalypse rhetoric that oddly hasn't had very much attention. If you know of counterexamples to that, I'd love to know, but I haven't found very much that acknowledges that actually in all of the modern literature on that subject. If we pay attention to it, maybe it can help us to bring into being a version of apocalypse rhetoric that doesn't just acknowledge the voices of marginalized communities, but also more specifically helps us to think about empire, the way in which the experience of empire has been so central to shaping the problems we're facing, and obviously we've seen versions of that in Annelise's talk earlier and many, many others through these few days. Okay, there are many different places one can look for ancient apocalypse narrative. You can start with the Book of Revelation. That's an obvious place. It's regularly read these days as a kind of resistance literature within a post-colonial frame. Although it's actually much less interested in images of environmental disaster than some of these other texts. There are some Hellenistic Egyptian texts from by Hellenistic I mean sort of 4th to 1st century BCE that are relevant. A text called the Oracle of the Potter, for example, that I've been looking at recently. Interesting work here by Helen van Noorden in Cambridge on a set of texts called the Sibylline Oracles, which again uses environmental, ecological imagery a lot. One of the things these visions of environmental apocalypse tell us, or they're meant to tell us, I think, in the ancient text, is that imperial dominance cannot last. They tell us that the vision of cosmic order that empire projects is just a pale imitation of some higher divine order that the victims of oppression will have access to when the current order has been overthrown. But the main text I want to give you today, just a very more briefly, I think, than the Aristides one, partly just because I happen to be working on it at the moment, isn't actually a straightforward apocalypse text. It's book one of a text called The Life of Moses by the 1st century CE Jewish writer Philo of Alexandria. And Philo basically rewrites the Exodus story, but in doing so he hugely expands the images of environmental damage in the original. So if you look at it side by side with the version he would have been using from the Septuagint version, often the things he's adding in are about bits of environmental imagery in various kinds. And some of those rewritings are really quite extravagant here. So, I mean, just to give you one example of what I mean by that, this is a passage not in the original biblical version. So he says, the punishment directed at the Egyptians was different from the usual kind, for the elements of the universe, earth, air, fire, water, carried out the assault. God's judgment was that the materials which had served to produce the world should serve also to destroy the land of the impious. So that's, I suppose, reversing imperial images of dominance over the natural world. Philo's account is also much more sensory than the original. This is a fantastic example of that. It's much more corporeal, physical. So this is from the first plague, the rivers of blood. At once, from Ethiopia to the sea, it turned into blood, and so did also the lakes, canals, springs, wells, and fountains, and all the existing water supply of Egypt. Consequently, having nothing to drink, they dug up the ground along the banks. The veins thus opened up, spouted out squirts of blood, which shot up as in hemorrhages, and not a drop of clear liquid was anywhere to be seen. Every kind of fish died there, since its life-giving properties had become a means of destruction, so the general stench pervaded everything from all these bodies rotting together. Also a great multitude of men killed by thirst lay in heaps at the crossroads, since their relatives had not the strength to carry the dead to the tombs. It's amazing stuff. The Egyptians, of course, are overwhelmed, but even so they do not learn their lesson quickly. The Egyptian pharaoh is one of the great climate change deniers of pre-modern history, pre-modern literature. But as in the Iliad-Aristides example, one of the really striking things here is the theme of differential impact. Of course, that's there in the original. The Hebrews were entirely unaffected. And again, Philo gives that idea much more prominence than in the original version. It's very clear also that these plagues are intended to overturn Egyptian mistreatment of the Hebrews earlier, almost to take revenge. So, I mean, just to back that up with one example, this is a passage from earlier in the work, which is describing the Egyptian mistreatment of the Hebrews. Again, I'll read this out. This was shown by the way in which they died one after the other, as though they were victims of a pestilence to be flung unburied outside the borders by their masters, who did not allow the survivors even to collect dust to throw upon the corpses, or even to shed tears for their kinsfolk or friends thus pitifully done to death. There's a clear link, I think, with the passage I read out a moment ago, the fate of the Egyptians in the plague of blood. Exactly the same fate awaits the bodies of the Egyptians later on. Also, interestingly, that imagery, that subjection to environmental horrors, picks up on Philo's reflections in some of his other works on mistreatment of Jews in Alexandria by Romans. So he's commenting, I think, on Roman Empire too here. And that, interestingly, is not, they're relatively muted, those links, but I think they're fairly clear cut even so. And it's interesting to me that hasn't, as far as I can see, been picked up very much in work on this text. So Philo's not just talking about Egyptian empire in the distant past, he's talking about the Roman Empire of the present. And there are a couple of points where we even see the Hebrews celebrating and rejoicing at the infliction of suffering on the Egyptians and their own freedom from damage, in a way which is not unlike Iliad-Aristides' celebrations, actually. They're horrifying passages in some ways. They're singing hymns of praise as they see this damage inflicted on their oppressors. So once again, there in ancient thinking about environmental disaster, often there's nothing to worry about if you're on the right side of it. So let me give you a quick summary. I just haven't got time really to show you more of that, but to sum up, I think there are two possibilities for using this material. Perhaps no reason why we can't do both. First of all, going back to these texts might help us to see the imagery of apocalypse, biblical disaster freshly, or at least more clearly. It might help us to envisage a situation where we want to reject apocalypse imagery even more firmly than we would have done already, on the grounds that it has this built-in invitation to take up a pose of complacency, which involves rejoicing at your own freedom from harm and viewing that actually as a sign of moral and cultural superiority. I think we could explore a second, quite different response by thinking about how apocalypse narrative could give expression to experiences of oppression and inequality and environmental damage that are deeply intertwined with the continuing consequences of empire, especially if we sidestep some of the more vengeful, more vindictive manifestations of that tradition. It involves listening to the voices of post-colonial subjects who tell us that a version of apocalypse is already happening now. I think that assumption is central to the ancient apocalypse and biblical disaster traditions. So the punishment that comes to the Egyptians is a version of what the Egyptians were already suffering then. Just to give you one example, one way into this, this is one article I've come across recently which I found very helpful as a way into thinking about that, thinking about apocalypse rhetoric from a post-colonial perspective and pointing out that a lot of current apocalypse rhetoric tends to sideline the voices of post-colonial subjects. So just to sum up, either way, however we play that, I hope I've given you at least a glimpse of the way in which thinking about the text of the past can help us to defamiliarize or think again about aspects of present-day environmental rhetoric, environmental discourse, to ask maybe even some new questions about them. I guess there's a risk of problematic connotations in pretty much any metaphors we choose. Metaphors for environmental change, environmental response, often slip out of our control. They can be contaminated by unintended associations. I guess we tried to deal with that in this event by choosing some fresh metaphors, turbulence, emergence, enchantment, which maybe don't have quite the same baggage attached to them. Perhaps that is one way forward. But that need not stop us from trying at the same time to be self-conscious about more commonly used images, and again, the kind of cultural baggage they carry with them. Looking back to the legacies of ancient environmental thinking can sometimes help us to see that baggage more clearly, and perhaps to steer our way towards more healthy, more productive uses of metaphor in our understanding of human-environment relations in the present. Thank you. That's it.